Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 7, yes, 7, of my 5th video game generation retrospective. Now, part 1, of course, was about the generation as a whole, and the subsequent parts have been about each individual console in that generation that I'm fortunate enough to own. Now, like you, I think about the N64. I think about the Sony PlayStation whenever the 5th generation comes to my mind. But I wanted to talk about all the other ones because I felt they were worthy of at least having a video about. But now that we're past all of those, and of course the PlayStation as well, we can talk about the final entrance into that series, which of course was the Nintendo 64. Possibly Nintendo's most infamous console for a lot of reasons. It's a cartridge-based console. That was a very strange decision for a lot of reasons. It has ultimately led to a lot of people absolutely loving this console and a lot of people absolutely hating this console. Now, I'm in the camp, of course, I like this console. It was one of my most identified childhood consoles, and I'll talk about that later. But for now, let's explore the decision to have used cartridges on this thing. Having this console come out last meant that it had all of the hardware capabilities and time behind it to be the most powerful console in that generation. But then Nintendo made the idiotic decision, in hindsight, to use cartridges, which ended up limiting the console big fucking time. Now, that's where this generation is very interesting, additional to all the other things I've ever said about how it has so many different entrances into it, is that despite having 9 consoles in it, there's no console that definitively stands out as, like, hands down, the most powerful machine. A lot of people love to claim the N64 was, and I would like to believe it too, but often it would be considered a technical marvel if things on the Saturn and the PS1 could be ported to it, basically just because of that cartridge problem. So let's explore the cartridges, right? Okay, why did that happen? Why did Nintendo go with cartridges? In order to understand that, we have to think back to, well, all the other consoles you saw in this video series, along with the handful of CD-based consoles that had come out in the 4th generation, including the Neo Geo CD, Philips CDI, the Sega CD, the TurboGrafx CD, etc. What do they all have in common, aside from the Jaguar? They use CDs, obviously. And every single one of them was a colossal disaster, save for the PS1 that obviously did end up being a monumental hit. But even though the PS1 came out briefly before the N64, it wasn't that wide of a gap in time. So my point is, I'm pretty sure that what happened was Nintendo looked at all these CD-based consoles and went, these are not working. Nobody's buying these things, nobody likes these things, nobody seems to want these things. They're also extremely expensive to produce. You know, there's a lot of moving parts in there. CD technology was relatively new, and I think Nintendo just kind of wanted to wash their hands of it. They knew cartridges were tried and true. They knew people understood what a cartridge was. They knew kids knew how to deal with cartridges, where they weren't necessarily sure kids were going to be able to properly handle CDs, etc. And I think that's probably why they just went, fuck it, we'll go with cartridges. Now, cartridges did give them certain advantages. It, of course, eliminated load times completely, but it also had a lot of disadvantages, and those are as follows. One, it was incapable of supporting video, incapable of supporting CD audio, had rendering issues, had texture issues, and the biggest one, storage capacity. So your average N64 game can only hold about 8 megabytes of data, whereas CD can hold 700 megabytes. Now this is significant because a lot of developers went, fuck you, like we don't want to deal with that. They didn't like the limitation, they didn't like how hard it would be to get their games over to the N64 for that reason. And also, additionally, CDs were vastly cheaper to produce than cartridges were, because CDs are just pieces of plastic. Whereas cartridges have chipsets, they got a lot of parts in them, they're a lot of solid plastic like this, their artwork, and there's a lot in a cartridge that's not in a CD. So Nintendo's brilliant idea with cartridges was to pass the savings on to you as a customer. For example, the Sega Saturn, it launched $400. PlayStation, $300. N64 at launch was only $200 because it didn't have to deal with any CD technology. It's essentially just a motherboard inside of a plastic case. And that was great for you until you think about the games and how expensive the games started getting. And a lot of developers eventually just decided to jump ship on Nintendo and said, we're going over to Sony and to a lesser extent Sega because they don't have this problem. And that really hurt Nintendo in the long run because a lot of developers still don't really want to work with them. I mean, that's where they are now, again, still with the Wii U. Still a lot of developers don't want to work with them, kind of no matter what they do. And that's unfortunate. It really all kind of started on this console. And I think the developer that probably hurt them the most was Square. You know, they were making Final Fantasy games exclusively for Nintendo. And then after the cartridge debacle, they basically said, you know, fuck it, we're going over to the PlayStation. Or, of course, Final Fantasy VII helped to create the PlayStation into the juggernaut that it ended up being. Part of the other reason I think that Nintendo decided not to go with CDs was largely their burned out deal they had with Sony when they PlayStation, as we originally know it, was an add-on for the Super Nintendo. I think they just wanted nothing to do with CDs and wanted to stick with cartridges. But I think they realized, in fact we know very, very quickly, Nintendo realized they had made a mistake with the cartridge concept. Now, lucky for them, they were smart enough to allow you to take out the jump pack, which is basically just RAM, and replace it with an expansion pack right there, the red one. And that allowed for additional power to be put into the console that a lot of games could utilize more effectively. But it wasn't enough. So actually in 1995, a year before the console releases in North America, 2 years before it releases in Europe and Australia, Nintendo announces this. This is the Nintendo 64 DD. For everyone who says the N64 hands down was the most powerful console, herp derp, no, this is actually the proof that it was not. See, again, cartridges were so limiting that they had no choice but to delve into this concept. Basically what this is an add-on, kind of like the Sega CD, for the Nintendo 64. Again, announced in 1995. The intention was to say, look, we know we kind of screwed up with the idea of cartridges, so rather than forcing games to have to go through this incredibly limited port, you're going to go through the bottom here. And as a result, you're going to be able to put your games on these, like, let me show you one real quick. Onto these, like, they were basically like floppy disks, like that. They look very similar to floppy disks, you know. And they were cheaper to produce, the communication speeds were better, they also could hold more memory, and they were capable of video and more higher quality audio and stuff. Not full-on CD capability, but they were kind of Nintendo's like quick fix idea to try and keep the console, shall we say, competitive. It was already competitive, but to give it an advantage. Unfortunately, it did not end up working out. Nintendo, basically Nintendo of America, as I understand it, it was actually the ones that kind of axed the project. They kind of looked at it and said, did you guys just forget about that Sega 32X thing? Do you really want to launch this console at $200 and then tell everybody they have to buy this additional piece of hardware to get the N64 gaming experience? At that point, you're talking about like $400 worth of crap, and it's still not necessarily going to be enough. And I think they just, Nintendo of America was basically the ones who said, fuck that. But they kept kind of stringing people along, telling them this thing was going to come out. And a lot of the games that we now mostly associate with the N64, example Ocarina of Time, were originally developed for the 64 DD. The intention was that, you know, it's going to have so much more ability, and it's going to truly be able to tap into what the N64 is capable of, that, you know, we can kind of forget where we even did cartridges. It'll almost be like we did a CD console from the get-go. Because if they had done CDs, hands down, N64, most powerful in generation, no debate about it. But they didn't do that. So they kept making all these promises of these games that were coming for it, and then slowly they started watering those games down and re-releasing them onto, or releasing them in the first place, onto cartridges just to get some version of them out there. So as weird as it might seem to sound, while you might love Ocarina of Time, it would have actually been a shit ton better if it had come out on the 64 DD. This thing obviously did eventually get released, because you see one right here. It did not come out until December of 1999 in Japan only, through an incredibly limited quantity and means. Now, by that point, nobody gave a shit. The Dreamcast had actually been out for over a year in Japan, had been out for a few months in North America and Europe, and the PS2 was right around the corner, so there was really no reason for the 64 DD to even come out at all, but it did. I think there was like a total of like 13 games. I have a couple of them right here. I got this is an expansion kit for F-Zero X. This is actually a very neat thing that showed off what this was capable of, where it would tap into pre-existing games like F-Zero, obviously in this case, give it additional features, additional characters, additional abilities, and so on, and update the game in a lot of ways. And then it had original titles like this. This is Doshin the Giant. The artwork on it is terrible, but look it up. It's a pretty neat game. So the N64 other than that, the console itself, the version that we all remember, just the standalone console. Now, it was very neat. It brought a lot of cool things to the table, like the 4 controller ports. Prior to that, you only had 2 controller ports unless you were using things like multi-taps. And of course, we have to talk about its infamous controller. Now, this controller is... I like the controller because I grew up on it, but it's one of those things where everybody looks at it for the first time and is just like, what is that? I don't like that. But when you hold it, you never really know which way you're supposed to hold it. You're supposed to hold it like this, you're supposed to hold it like this. And in my opinion, it's game sensitive. It just depends on what game it is. Now, this controller was actually designed around this game, Super Mario 64, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But they developed the controller intentionally just for that game, and then they kind of let all the other games kind of work their way around it. Now, at the time, most games were being saved onto cartridges. If you had CD consoles, obviously you needed memory cards. Nintendo, apparently in an effort to free up more space on their games, not all of them, mind you, they released an actual memory card for the console that you could put into the back. So this didn't end up getting used that much. Most games ended up just saving onto the cartridge anyway. But there are some games that actually support this, and you can have a memory card. And we'll talk about that machine in a bit. But let's go on to talk about some of the games. Now, these are some of my favorite games. And you'll notice that most of them are first party. First up, of course, we had Super Mario 64. I don't think there's much I need to say about this. This is one of those, this is a game that just, it defines a console. It was basically the only launch game that was out there, not literally, but pretty much. And this just blew my mind. I'm sure it blew a lot of people's mind when this thing came out. Full 3D capabilities. When I saw this, I was just like, for the first time ever, I was just like, wow. Which, again, I'll talk about in a bit. We had Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. This was a really cool game that I played a lot as a kid. I remember playing this and loving the first level, the Hoth level, where you're just, you know, shooting at Imperial walkers and stuff. And then once you got to the Dash Rendar stuff, I remember as a kid not really liking that part. As an adult, I enjoy it more, but as a kid, I didn't really like that part. Mario Kart 64. To this day, probably still the best Mario Kart game in the entire franchise. I love Mario Kart 8. I love a lot of the ones that, in fact, I don't think there's any of them that I played that were like, fuck this one. But this probably still stands out to me as perhaps the best one. This game, GoldenEye 007. Come on, who the fuck hasn't played GoldenEye? This game revolutionized the first-person shooter. Prior to that, you just had Doom. This really brought you into the next wave. And another interesting thing about this game is that it's obviously more famous than the movie it's based on, which is very bizarre. Much like today, we had movie-based games based on popular movies that had just come out, and usually those games always suck. This is a rare exception where the game is not only better than the movie, but exceeds the movie in so much in popularity that the game gets sequels and the movie does not. Yes, there's been more Bond movies, but there was never a direct sequel to GoldenEye. You get my point. So that was a pretty cool game. Super Smash Brothers. One of Nintendo's neater ideas, probably due to the fact they lost so many third-party developers, they had to start come up with new ideas, and this was just an obviously good one. Let's take a bunch of our characters and put them all in a fighting game together. Herp derp, legends. Star Wars Rogue Squadron. This is a really fun, I want to say it's kind of like Star Fox a little bit, but not quite. It's obviously Star Wars themed. And it actually takes very good advantage of the N64's expansion pack. So if you ever get the N64 expansion pack in this game, it looks beautiful on the N64. It really does. This is a game that you probably wouldn't expect to see. WWF WrestleMania 2000. In the late 90s, WWF, as it was then, now WWE, was retardedly popular. And this game, to me, just defines the cheesiness of all of that. And this is one of the games to this day I'll still pop it in and play it. I just had so much fun on it. And Star Fox 64. Now, Star Fox 64 was revolutionary, and for a lot of reasons. Not only was the gameplay mechanics just a hell of a lot of fun, but it also introduced the concept here of the Rumble Pack. This is the beginning of the Rumble features in games. A lot of people falsely credit the PS1 with this just because of the DualShock controller, but that controller did not come out until after this had already done that. And, Sony had to update their controller based on this. Now, this is the first game to ever do that, and I remember that being just a baffling thing that they figured. That was kind of like finding a new place to put cheese on a pizza. Like when, I think it was like Pizza Hut or somebody figured out how to put cheese inside of the crust, like, you know, the part you hold on a pizza. This was like the same thing for video games. You're just like, what? Like a whole new psychotic concept. You couldn't even believe they had somehow figured out how to do that. It was really very impressive. And I remember when this came out, Blockbuster used to rent this with the Rumble Pack because it was bundled when you bought it. But a lot of people would rent the game and just keep the Rumble Pack. Now, I, of course, didn't do that, but a lot of people did end up doing that. So whenever you would go back to rent the game yourself, if you weren't like the first person there, they were gone. I had a couple of friends I knew who had done that, and I thought that was shitty of them, but they did it anyway. I knew other people, well, I know people through the internet who've claimed to have done that. It was, and if people did return it, often somebody would eventually rent it and keep it. There was very few Blockbusters that ever really kept a tab on that kind of thing. I bought mine, it came with the game. So yeah, that's just some examples of some N64 games that I grew up on. I know you probably were expecting to see Ocarina of Time. We all know that one, so there's no reason for me to talk about it. And of course I got more. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about my personal experience with the N64, like for when I first got it. Obviously it defined a large part of my childhood. It really was just one of those consoles you had as a kid that just kind of said, this is amazing, this is what fun is, etc. But it didn't start out like that for me. Now, if you saw my previous video on the PlayStation, I mentioned that around 1995, my mom let me get a new game console, and I had the choice between the PS1 and the 32X. Wisely so, I picked the PlayStation. Sorry, Sega, I love you, but that was not the one to pick, so I'm glad I didn't pick a 32X. The next year, obviously, the N64 came out, and some of my friends were getting that instead of a PlayStation, and some of my cousins were getting that instead of a PlayStation. And I did the thing that kids do, and I'm sure some of you who are younger do this too, and I'm going to give you a little life advice. Drop this shit, it makes you feel like an idiot in a few years, just trust me. What I did was that whenever I saw an N64, you fuck that thing, it's stupid, I hate it, because I didn't have one. You know, I couldn't afford one, or I was jealous. You know, that's what you do, that's what fanboyism is typically, is just you hate the thing arbitrarily just because generally you for some reason gravitated to another one. And then you'll inevitably see something on that console that you really like, but you have to tell yourself you hate it. It makes you feel like an idiot when you grow up and you realize how dumb you were for doing that. So I did that, of course. You know, at one point I went to a friend's house, and he was playing Super Mario 64. And I think that was the first time I had seen Super Mario 64. And I just remember looking at it, and in my mind I said, this is amazing. And externally I was like, it's not that impressive. No, it's bad, stupid. I don't like it. That's because that's what kids do. You act like little turds. It's just what you do. I know, I did it, and eventually I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I really wanted an N64, and I couldn't figure out how to make that happen because obviously I had gotten a PS1. And that's just what I was going to have to be rocking. And I had to deal with, you know, schoolyard, fanboy wars. No, N64 is better, it's got this. No, PlayStation's better, it's got this. Blah, blah, blah. Never heard anybody talk about the Saturn, sadly. Again, didn't even know it existed. But the day that all changed for me was one of the most bizarre days of my life. I'm sitting at home playing PlayStation after some day at school, right? And my mom comes home from work. And I don't know if she was like, I don't know if she just gotten late or she was high or what the fuck had happened. I'm not seriously suggesting either of those things. But she had come home and she was just like in an unbelievably good mood. And she's like, Adam, I got a surprise for you. And I was like, oh, okay. And she pulls out this box. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking it's an N64. Nope. This was very bizarre. It's a little side story here. She opens this thing up and inside, you have to understand I still live in Chicago, and I grew up during the Michael Jordan Bulls era. And she pulls out this picture of Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, and Scottie Pippen all autographed. And I was like, because, you know, that's like my heroes all signed on this one thing together. I still have it. It's an amazing little thing. And I'm sure you're thinking, like, who gives a shit? What does that have to do with anything? All right, so I got that. And I was just in such a good mood from all that and everything. And she's like, so what are you doing over there? And I think I was playing, like, Twisted Metal 2 or something. I don't know exactly what I was playing. I was playing something. And I said, oh, I'm playing this, and she's like, how are you liking it, you know, like a PlayStation? And I said, oh, it's really good, you know, and then somehow the subject of the N64 came up. I think I had mentioned that one of my friends had one, or, you know, Nintendo had a new game console. I don't know exactly how it came up. I mean, this was a while ago. This was almost like 20 years ago, which is depressing. And she said, oh, so do you want an N64? And I was like, well, yeah, you know, someday. And she was like, fuck it, get in the car, we'll go buy one. You got me. I don't know why she suddenly did that. But we drove out to Best Buy, came back with an N64, and I was just like, oh, I have one now. And so I got to play a lot of Super Mario 64 at first, and I think at that point I was also playing Mario Kart 64 as well. And I had a really genuinely good time. And then that console, really, it and the PlayStation is just what I played for the next few years. And obviously the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo still had them, but they kind of took a back seat because obviously their time was basically done. And that's probably why I kind of forgot about Sega to a certain extent, because at that era, Genesis, SNES, I was all about Genesis. I mean, I love my SNES, but Genesis first. And then that's probably why I didn't gravitate towards the N64 immediately. And the spiritual successor to the Genesis felt to be the PlayStation. Obviously was not literally the successor to it, but so that's kind of where I sat for a while. And those were the 4 consoles I had for a very long time, other than my Atari 2600 at that point. And yeah, man, that was childhood. And the N64 is special to me in that regard because it's the last console I got to really play in my childhood. You know, because by the time the Dreamcast was out, I was in middle school, you know, entering high school soon. And there's a certain nostalgic feel that you can only have for a certain period of your life in a certain age, if that makes sense. And by the time the Dreamcast was out, I was beyond that point. So it was the last console that really was truly a part of my childhood. Not like my teen years, but my childhood was the N64. And for that reason, I can still go back and play the N64 whenever I feel like revisiting my childhood. It's probably the one I most quickly go to. I'll just pop in Star Fox or whatever, and I'll just say, all right, that's just what I'm going to do right now, and I'll feel like I'm 7 or 8 again. You know, I don't know. That's just how it is. And I love it for that reason. I think it's a lot of fun. It's obviously a very, very cheap console now. You can find the console extremely easily. It's not hard to find. The games are starting to skyrocket, and they'll probably be a lot more expensive in the next couple of years. So strike sooner rather than later if you want to build yourself any kind of collection. But yeah, guys, I mean that's kind of the end of the N64. It's kind of the end of my experiences with it. It was a lot of fun. I want to thank you guys for watching not only this video, but hopefully all the other videos in this series. I hope you like the series overall, and you know, let me know. Do you want me to do this again for the 4th generation? It might take a little while before I get to it, but if you want me to do that, let me know. Maybe I can strike that up at some point. But yeah, that's it for now, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.